Hey everybody, this is Mr. Storm, and in this video we are going to set up our enemy so that it actually bounces, or not really bounces, but doesn't go off of these platforms. And we're going to set up barriers for our enemies to be trapped inside. So that way we can keep our enemies from leaving the platforms if we don't want them to. This is going to require us to discuss some physics layers. So let's talk quickly about physics layers and what they are. Essentially, what a physics layer is let's take a look at collision over here. In collision, we have two things. One's called layer and one is called mask. The layer means this is the thing, this is the layer that this object can interact with physically, right? So this is the layer that it's on. The mask means these are the other layers, the other physics layers that thing can interact with. So let's imagine I want my enemy to be able to bounce off of an invisible wall, right? But I don't want that wall to stop my player at any point, right? What I can do is I can set my enemy on its own layer, my player on its own layer, and this wall on a separate layer. And I can tell my game that my enemy needs to interact with the wall, but the player should not interact with the wall either. Should not interact with the wall. We can do the same thing with the pickup here, right? The way we have our pickup script, let me just go ahead and put this right here. The way we have the pickup script, if anything bumps into this, it'll go away and add to my count. So if we were to play the game here and watch the enemy bump into, notice that my enemy just collected a battery for me, but that's not what I wanted, right? So we actually need to change our collision layers so that the enemies don't interact with the pickups and our player isn't going to interact with these invisible walls we set up for keeping our enemies contained. So the way we do that is we go to Project and Project Settings. And inside here, you'll see a bunch of different options, a bunch of different menu items. If you scroll down to Layer Names and 2D Physics, we have a bunch of layers here. Now the layers we're going to need is, we'll say player, the layer 1 is going to be player. Layer 2 will be platforms. Layer 3, we'll call this item. Layer 4 will be enemy, and we'll say layer 5 is enemy barriers. Okay, let's go ahead and close that. Now if we were to go to each of our objects, let's start up here at the top. Our one-way tiles. If we look down here, oh, these are already set up. So the one-way tiles are platforms. We want to make sure that they're not player, right? They're platform. And we want them to interact with player. We don't want them to interact with enemy barriers, but we do want them to interact with the enemy, right? So the enemy needs to interact with that, and so does the player. Let's go ahead and play and make sure that that's working properly. And it is, right? Our enemies are able to collide, and we can still jump on the thing. That works. Okay. Our solid tiles are going to be the same. They're going to be a platform. They're going to interact with the player and the enemy. Okay. The player, and let's actually open up the player object itself. The player, let's turn off all this real quick. The player is going to be on the player layer. That's hard to say, player layer. It is going to interact with platforms. It's going to interact with the items. It's going to interact with the enemy, but it is not going to interact with enemy barriers. Okay, so it's not going to touch the enemy barriers at all. All right, the enemy object, let's go to their collision. They are not the player. They are enemy. And they are going to interact with the player, platforms, no items, and they are going to interact with the enemy barriers. Okay. And let's look at these pickups as well. Let's open up the pickup. So this is going to be item, and it's going to interact with the player, but pretty much nothing else. Okay. So let's test a couple things out. First of all, let's save all those changes that we've made. Let's go back to level 1. Let's test to see if our enemy will pick up our battery. And look, it just passes right through it, which is exactly what we want. That means they're not interacting with each other on that physics layer. So that's pretty solid right there. That's a great thing that we've just done. We've made it so that these are not interactable at all. The pickups and the enemies completely ignore each other, which is fantastic. So there's a new thing that we need to add to this area, to this game. We want to add basically barriers on these platforms so that our enemy won't leave the platform whenever it hits the edge, right? So what we can do is up here we can create a new, and we'll make this a static body 2D. And let's call it enemy barriers. Okay. And this static body 2D, let's go to its collision. It is not the player. It's going to be enemy barriers. It's not going to interact with the player or platforms or item. It will only interact with the enemy. Okay. Now this enemy barriers needs a collider. So let's add a new child node, and it's going to be a collision shape 2D. Create. And let's give it a rectangle shape and bring it over here. And let's just create a nice little barrier for our enemy to bump into. And then, and I'm going to make it really tall just so we can test this out. And then let's create another one. Actually, we can just duplicate this one. Let's duplicate it and let's move it over here and put it there. So now with this little quick thing that we've just done, we should be able to, our enemy should be able to bump into these and turn around whenever they hit it. There we go. Bump and bump. So our enemy is bumping into those barriers and it's able to be contained within that platform. Now the ultimate test is to see if this barrier stops my player from going onto that platform or not, which it does not. I can pass completely through that barrier, no problem. Okay, perfect. So now we've been able to contain our enemies. Let's make these just a bit smaller. So that, because the enemy is not super big, we don't need those to be super big either. And what we can do is we can actually just add some more enemies. Let's go ahead and add more enemies to our game. Enemy. And I'm going to move this one up to this platform. And maybe I'll have it going that direction. I'll have it going away from the player. And in my enemy barriers, I can add some more collision shape 2Ds. And I'll give it a rectangle shape. And I'll put it right here. And let's duplicate that one and move it over. Let's test this out and see if that's working. Okay, so I have enemies going both. There we go. That looks super nice. Now, what happens if you want this enemy to be able to drop down onto this level? Well, all you do is turn off that collider, and now the enemy can bump off of this edge here, but then when it gets to this edge, it'll actually drop onto the... Oh, nope. I just turned off the visibility. I didn't actually delete it. Let's do this the right way, shall we? So now it'll bump off the back here, and then when it gets all the way to the end here, it'll actually drop off. Oh, but it lands on that one. So that's something you want to pay attention to. But anyway, so these colliders, these can be used to create some containers, some areas where our enemies can't escape. Alrighty, I'm going to duplicate this one. I'm going to add the new one, or that one back in there. Okay. Now, believe it or not, our enemies are actually pretty close to being done. I want to reiterate with those physics layers again. It's really important that you pay attention to your physics layers, because if you, for some reason, mess this up, if you change it so that your physics layers have different or they're not identified properly, then your objects aren't going to interact the right way. So again, layer is what layer that object is, and mask is what layers that object should interact with. All right, easy enough. Looks pretty good to me. I think this is pretty good. We can actually add more enemies and barriers to this if we really wanted to. But for now, I'm just going to leave mine like this. You can add more to yours. In the next video, we're going to get into how our player can interact with the enemy. Specifically, if the player bumps into the side of the enemy, or if the enemy bumps into the player, then the game will restart. But if the player jumps on top of the enemy, then the enemy will get squished and die. So that's the last thing we need to do with enemy, and then we will be finished with this part. Okay, thanks for paying attention to this video, and I will see you next time.